All right, back together again in the same room, and looking forward to another great conversation this week right here on Curiosity, Not Judgment. Welcome. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
So, Gary and I both had the opportunity to hear a guest speaker at a particular event, and then Gary went on to YouTube and looked for some other content by this gentleman. I think we were just both riveted by the conversation and the notions that he presented. And so, do you mind me passing the baton to you to introduce him by name, just so we give him all the credit for a lot of the content that we're going to talk about today, but really want to get into this idea about a reverse bucket list that he mentioned in some of his content.
Reverse bucket list is kind of cool, isn't it, as a concept? The guy's name is Arthur Brooks, and he is a professor in the Harvard Business School, but he's not teaching accounting or statistics or marketing. He literally has a course called The Science of Happiness. And there's 180 students in it with a 400 student waiting list.
That's amazing.
And you would think, as far as Harvard MBA, those kids would be pretty happy. They got into Harvard, et cetera, et cetera. But he has some insights on happiness that are fascinating. And in those insights, and among those insights, he talks about people in their later stages of life. And it turns out that everybody thinks that your happiness increases as you get older. It doesn't. It kind of decreases, but then it starts increasing in your 40s and 50s and then plateaus. But that plateau, that flat line, is not really, everybody kind of just stays the same as when they're 50. It turns out that half of the people get really happy and happier, and half get really unhappy. And we probably understand that from our own experience. And so as part of that second part of life, and what he calls the second curve, which we could go into at other things, he says we ought to have a reverse bucket list, because as Americans especially, we get into the accumulation of things. And he says, in your 20s and 30s, that's fine, and that should crescendo about age 39, and that's about the time you're most productive. You have your biggest ideas, if you look out over history, people have their biggest ideas, but when they're 39, they have their best work. But then you have to start preparing in life for not doing your best work, and for not accumulating things, and think about more of teaching, mentoring, giving back, and using your crystallized intelligence versus your flow intelligence. And so I just thought that was interesting, because he's saying, instead of saying, okay, let's make a bucket list of everything I want, start looking at, and he has this great ratio of haves versus wants. And he says, in order to be happy, that ratio has to be greater than 1. And so there's 2 ways to do it. Increase your haves all the time, getting more and more stuff, or decrease your wants. And so he says a really good thing to do is go ahead and put down a bucket list of everything you think you want, but then look at it and say, what do you really want? And make that very few. And the rest of it, just kind of hold it lightly. And maybe I'll get this, maybe I won't. Don't get too attached. Because if we get attached to a bunch of stuff that we want, then that just creates a flurry of wanting things that doesn't really, it just inflames our want instead of our satisfaction and happiness with what we have.
Yeah. That instantly caught my attention, that concept of a reverse bucket list, because many folks, I think, have challenges economically in their 20s to be able to do some of the things, right? And you finally get established in a career, maybe in your 30s, and maybe you've got young kids, and by the time you're at the end of your 30s, maybe you've got some flexibility and you can pay for some trips and to do things that you had always wanted to do. So to hear that kind of your peak is at 39 and then you move on into your 40s, there really does have to be a reevaluation. And are those things that you had wanted in your 20s as important to you in your 40s and beyond? And, especially as we get into each passing decade beyond that, are there things that we can just remove from the list so that it's not an unfulfilled longing, but it's simply we are content with less?
Yeah, and there's a famous song by AJR that says, "I set my bar real low,"
Mm.
and that's not what this is about. It's not about setting your bar low. It's about setting your expectations appropriately
Mm-hmm.
so that you don't want more than you have and
Mm.
or more than you need. We've heard that one before. It's almost trite, but just set it appropriately. And I think again, how many times do we talk about a subject where people just kind of take a surface view
Mm.
and they don't do that extra little bit of, and sometimes it's 30 minutes, just that little extra bit of thinking
Yeah.
about, do I really want all this? Is my expectation that I have all of this?
Mm-hmm.
Do I need, the vacation home in the Hamptons, and do I need the this? And we were at a wedding this weekend, and my oldest grandson, Noah, getting married.
Wow.
And
Congrats.
thank you. And wonderful, wonderful wedding. And it was in a place called Lake Geneva, Wisconsin.
Hmm.
Now, those of you in the Midwest will know Lake Geneva. It is kind of Chicago's playground. It's a very large lake, and it has a lot of very large, expensive homes around it.
Okay.
We Airbnb'd in one of them,
Mm.
and but it's it's a clearly a vacation home community.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about the amount of money that is in these homes, and that's a second home to someone, you think, wow, they've accumulated a lot,
Mm.
and and that's good, yay for them. But I also started looking at some of the houses that clearly the upkeep on these.
Oh
I
goodness,
mean,
yeah.
I saw one of the yards. There's a path. There's a very interesting path that goes along the lake that everybody who buys property along the lake buys into that path being there. It's a
Mm.
public path, and they maintain it with their own. And each one, it goes from cobblestone to gravel to brick, and each one is a little different depending on the home. But one time I saw all of this wood up there, and it's a dock, and apparently
Mm.
this lake freezes and you can't leave your dock, a
Oh,
normal wood dock, in there.
yeah.
So you have to take it out and then put it
Mm.
back in. Well, there was several houses we passed by where the dock was up in the yard. Well, this is the time of year where if you were going to use that house,
You would think
the
it would
dock
be in
would
the
be in the
water.
water.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, sometimes we buy things and just to have them, and then we
Mm.
don't really have the wherewithal to maintain them
Yeah.
or to do it long term. And I think just having things just to have things can be its own
Mm-hmm.
vicious cycle.
For sure. I don't think I have stuff on my bucket list, but I definitely have experiences. And one of the things that I've long wanted to do is I've said that for my 50th birthday, I would very much like to go do the Christmas markets in Germany.
Wow.
And so, I would love for anybody that wants to join and save the money and get ready to go and do all that stuff. But I then have to pause and say, if that is a goal that we don't reach, or if that is a trip, an excursion that doesn't get to happen, am I going to be somehow unfulfilled? Am I
Mm-hmm.
going to feel like I've missed out? And I think, maybe there's a little bit of disappointment, but I haven't camped out there to say that this is something I must have. And so that point about holding things loosely, I think, is really key. We can dream, we can wish, we can plan, but if we posture ourselves to have those open-handed or those things in an open-handed posture, I think we're going to do a whole lot better with our end-of-life satisfaction levels.
Yeah, I think so. And if for some reason, health, economic, relationship, there's some reason why you don't get to do that on your 50th birthday, that might be okay.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about 4 categories of things that should be very important to us, and it's faith, family, friends, and meaningful work.
Mm-hmm.
And with respect to those things, I think if we really evaluated our bucket list and everything was on it. Now, a bucket list, and this is, by the way, we are not against having a bucket list.
Sure.
That's not the point. And this is the thing that's on your bucket list, if you really look at what is the prioritization of your life,
Mm-hmm.
there should be relationships with family members. There should be, other things above going to the Christmas market in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
However, if that could all work out and you have a goal, that'd be a great thing to do it. But it's not going to be. It shouldn't be the the end all of your happiness.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Totally agree. Because again, if life happens as it tends to do, it leaves you bitter if you've got your heart set on something like that. So I loved that notion of reverse bucket list, holding things lightly. And as you progress, what are some of those things that you can tick off because they just don't have the same weight of desire anymore. Maybe you wanted that Ferrari when you're 20, but by the time you're 50, maybe what you really want is a healthy grandchild in a minivan to take them around town.
Exactly. And that relationship is going to be key. And I think that's one of the main things. And so he says that toward the end of your life, or towards the second half of your life, you ought to be chipping away instead of adding to.
Yeah. And what a beautiful picture that is too, right? It's that idea of revealing whatever the piece of art that is there under the marble or under the jade or whatever culture you're looking at, but that idea that you've removed the excess and then what is left at the end is this beautiful work of art.
He uses that exact metaphor because he said he went to a very famous museum, I forget where it was, and he didn't have a whole lot of time, and so he hired a guide and said, hey, I want to learn 10 things, because it's a massive museum with lots of stuff, and I really like this story, and I'm going to do this someday. He says, I hired a guide, and I said, somebody who knew all about it, and tell me 10 things in here that are really fascinating and really good things to do. And the guy started asking the question, he goes, no, you pick them. Well, one of them was this really cool art thing that was a little city set in a hill, turned out to be a monastery, made out of jade. And he goes, well, I can just tell that that's Oriental or Eastern art versus Western. And he goes, you're exactly right. And he says, in Western art, we start with a blank canvas and we add to. And over time in your life, there's only so many things you can add, and then you're done. What do? You start painting over things, and that makes it uncomfortable. And he says, whereas in Eastern art, it's very typical to start with a piece of something and then chip away at it until its true form is revealed.
That's pretty incredible.
And I like that as a metaphor for our lives also. Instead of trying to just add to things and say, okay, I am my job, I am my second home, I am my car, whatever. No, I'm something. There's something inside of me that needs to be revealed. What can I chip away from my life? Those things that cost me a bunch of time to maintain, and to just do a bunch of activities just to have and hold.
Yeah.
Versus, and so those things are kind of surrounding me and make me, from the outside world who I am, versus chipping away until my true beauty can be revealed. That seems like a really good metaphor.
Yeah, I love it. So one of the other things that this gentleman brings up in this presentation was an equation, and really getting towards the root of happiness. And as you mentioned in the beginning, he teaches this course on happiness, and he set up the presentation by saying he quizzes the students first day of class to see, what is happiness, and they give a wide variety of answers, and he takes great delight in telling them all that they're wrong. And so he said it boils down to an equation. And again, I don't want to take any credit for this. This is not my idea. This was fully his. But I took a screenshot of it because it was such an impactful formula to me. And he says, if happiness isn't a feeling, what is it? And so the equation that he came up with, or through his studies has revealed, is enjoyment plus satisfaction plus meaning. And that equals happiness. And I think as we're talking about the removal of stuff, that really does settle into that satisfaction line, because we have learned to become satisfied with what we have, or we choose to be fully satisfied and immersed in the experiences that we're partaking in. We've enjoyed with satisfaction, we've added some meaning to it, and that produces the happiness.
Yeah, and just to go through that equation, and I'm an engineer, I love equations, and I love the way he breaks it down. And he starts out by saying that, a lot of people, when he asks those students, the students say, oh, happiness is the feeling I have when I'm with people I love, or it's the feeling I have when I'm doing something I love or something I like. and it's not a feeling. And he likens the metaphor he uses, which I really like, is a Thanksgiving dinner. He says the feeling would be equated to the smell of Thanksgiving dinner, but it's not the Thanksgiving dinner itself. And same thing with happiness. That feeling that you think you're having is really coming from those core ingredients in the turkey dinner. It's carbs and fats and proteins. In the happiness equation, it's like you said, enjoyment, satisfaction, and meaning. And he said, enjoyment is not pleasure. Most people think of enjoyment as pleasure. Enjoyment is pleasure plus people plus memories. And if you're doing pleasure by yourself, like pounding a six pack of Bud and by yourself in your room, that's not what they show on the commercial for trying to sell it, then that's not really enjoyment. And on satisfaction, I really liked exactly what you're saying about the accumulation of stuff. He says, the Rolling Stones got it wrong when Mick Jagger says, I can't get no satisfaction. Yeah, you can get satisfaction. You can't keep satisfaction. The line should be, I can't keep no satisfaction. And the problem is it's the homeostasis of once we achieve something, that becomes our norm, and it's not good enough anymore. We need more and more and more and more. And that's the problem. That's the hedonic treadmill he talked about, which is just wanting more and more stuff to be satisfied. He says, no, satisfaction is actually the achievement of something through struggle, which I really like, because if you haven't struggled for something, then it's really not an achievement. If it's just handed to you on a silver platter, well, then how is that providing satisfaction? It really isn't long term. And so, but the thing I really liked about that equation was the meaning part, because he said, you can have enjoyment, you can live without enjoyment, you can live without satisfaction for quite a while, but you can't spend 10 minutes in this world without meaning. And understanding what your purpose in life is, and exploring that, which I thought was really interesting too. But you can't get to any of this if you've surrounded stuff and you're depending your happiness on your stuff.
Yeah. I will admit I'm a little hung up on the 39-year-old peak sentence from earlier in the podcast.
Yeah.
I really have been kind of thinking about that as we're talking about all of this stuff. And I remember very vividly when I was 39 years old that at that time I was an executive director of a small nonprofit. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, maybe I'll make the 40 under 40 list, which is something that we do locally through a publication. And it's 40 individuals under the age of 40 who have done something substantial. And I did not. And I remember thinking, well, man, what now? And kind of maybe there was an assumption that I had peaked in and of myself. But I now at 46 am realizing I just now am really starting to grasp the sense of meaning in my work and finding a deep level of satisfaction, because I know that I'm bringing meaning to myself and to others through the work that I do. And so the 39-year-old thing, I'm going to, throw that one away. I'm going to put that out of my list and, continue to progress towards that deep satisfaction and deep meaning in the things that I do, because I am finding that even though the work is hard and the hours are long, there's so much more peace. There's so much more enjoyment overall for simply having that deep connection to meaning.
Yeah, and I think the meaning, though, that you're finding is not inconsistent with his 39-year-old peak theory. And I think that what you've done is you've moved from what he calls fluid intelligence to crystallized intelligence. And you've jumped to your second curve successfully. Okay. Whereas many people do not. And so, you coming up with innovative ways to run a nonprofit, to fundraise for a nonprofit, to promote a nonprofit, to communicate about a nonprofit. Those are things that you were accumulating up until the time you were 39, 40. Now you've got that intelligence and it's crystallized, and you're being able to practically articulate it through your work. You can explain it to different people much better than you've ever been able to do before. he talks about in the world of academia, the professors that the kids like, and he says, and kids don't like many professors these days, are the older ones because they have a unique ability to relate a complicated matter in a simple way, not a dumbed down way, but a simple way, because they have the ability to articulate things because of their crystallized intelligence versus their fluid. Anyway, I just thought that that's interesting, but I'm not sure it's inconsistent.
Okay. All right. I just felt like, man, well, what does that say for my 40s and beyond if I had my peak at 39?
Right.
But no, I appreciate just so many of the points that he brought forward. So I wish we could post a link to the presentation that we got to see, but that is not yet public, and it was a part of a leadership summit that he was getting ready to launch a book for. And so I think at some point there will be more content online, and hopefully that will circulate and make the round of TED Talks and all of those good things. But for right now, I think you're just going to have to deal with some of our notes and some of our reflections, but really was good stuff. And I was grateful for just a new perspective and just that value that I placed on having an ability to talk about happiness in another way, because I think we do, by and large, have it really wrong as Americans. I think we have often pursued happiness in ways that are fast and furious and do not lead or lend itself to lasting, deep satisfaction and relationships and ending well and all of those things that we really want to promote through this podcast.
Yeah, and I think it's Arthur S. Brooks. But if you Google Arthur Brooks, he has done a TEDx talk.
He has.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's on YouTube. I haven't seen what the content bit is.
Okay.
But he has several ideas and things that he has done, and his whole life, his own life, is a metaphor toward this. He was a CEO of a think tank when he had his 3940 revelation in his 50s. About pursuing happiness versus pursuing being the CEO of a think tank and trying to get incrementally better each year, right? Which is what the treadmill that he was on. And so, but anyway, he's done a TEDx talk. He's got the 1 hour YouTube that's on there, so you can find some various things about him.
Okay, good.
And the book that he wrote is called Love Your Enemies, because he talks about the fact that in this political world that we live in, there are 1 in 6 people in America who are not talking to a family member because of politics, which is just
amazing.
insane. And he says, it's fine to be, people think that we need total agreement, which is impossible. He says disagreements are fine, right? It's when disagreements lead to contempt.
Yeah,
and that
huge.
we all need to be warriors against contempt. It's okay to disagree with someone. You still need to respect them as a human being, respect their journey, and understand that you can have great discussions with people who don't think like you. As a matter of fact, aren't those the only discussions to have?
Maybe so.
And so anyway, he does a lot of really interesting thinking in his stuff.
All right, so Arthur Brooks. Look
Arthur
him up
Brooks.
if you want some more content from him. So I think we'll wrap it up with maybe 2 curious questions to leave you with today. One is, are there things that you can eliminate from your bucket list if you were going to do the reverse bucket list? And then what has your notion of happiness been in the past, and how might you redefine it now at the stage of life you're in?
Good luck on the second half of your life.
Absolutely. All right, we'll catch you all next week. Please, by all means, leave a comment if you've got some feedback and maybe some thoughts on things that you're going to slash from your list or ways that you're going to pursue happiness. Would love to hear from you. Curiosity, notjudgment.com, or your comment is welcome on our YouTube channel as well.
Take care.